Imagine being so unwanted by your own family that they'd use you as the punchline to a cruel joke, shipping you off as a mail-order bride not to find you happiness, but to humiliate a stranger they'd never even met. That's exactly what happened to Evangeline Blackwood in the spring of 1875, when her family decided the ugly daughter would make the perfect weapon to embarrass Colt Ashford, the wealthiest rancher in Copper Ridge, Colorado territory. But here's what the Blackwood family never counted on. Sometimes the very thing you throw away becomes someone else's most precious treasure. When Eva stepped off that dusty train in Copper Ridge, expecting rejection and shame, she found something her family had convinced her she'd never deserve. A man who looked past the surface and saw the extraordinary woman they'd been blind to her entire life. Because what started as a family's twisted revenge plot became the most beautiful love story the Colorado territory had ever witnessed. Eva wasn't the delicate, porcelain pretty bride that Colt Ashford had been expecting, but she was something far more valuable. She was real, she was strong, and she was everything he never knew he needed. While her family back east waited for news of their successful humiliation, Colt was falling head over heels for the woman they'd foolishly cast aside. This isn't just another mail-order bride story. This is the tale of a woman who discovered her own worth in the eyes of a man who saw her true beauty, and a rancher who learned that the best things in life don't come wrapped in pretty packages. It's about family betrayal that backfired spectacularly, about cruel jokes that became cosmic justice, and about how sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up giving us exactly what we need to find our destiny. What Eva's family didn't realize as they orchestrated their heartless prank was that they weren't just sending away their unwanted daughter. They were delivering a queen to her rightful kingdom, a heart to its perfect match, and a love story that would prove beauty isn't about what meets the eye, but what touches the soul. This is that story, raw, real, and absolutely triumphant. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, carried by the postman who still looked at Eva Blackwood with the same mixture of pity and awkwardness that had followed her through 28 years of life in Boston. She was sweeping the front steps of the Blackwood mansion when he approached, his eyes already darting away from her face in that familiar dance of polite avoidance she'd grown accustomed to. "Morning, Miss Blackwood," he mumbled, thrusting the envelope toward her without quite meeting her gaze. "Letter for the family. Looks important." Eva took the letter with steady hands, though her heart gave that familiar little skip it always did when correspondence arrived. In a world where she was consistently overlooked, ignored, and dismissed, letters represented possibility, the chance that somewhere, somehow, someone might actually want to hear from the Blackwood family's disappointing daughter. The envelope was thick, expensive paper, addressed to Miss Serafina Blackwood in bold masculine handwriting. Eva's stomach dropped as she recognized the return address: Colt Ashford, Copper Ridge, Colorado territory. Another suitor for her beautiful younger sister, no doubt. Another wealthy man who'd heard tales of Serafina's legendary beauty and wanted to claim her as his prize. "Eva!" Her stepmother's shrill voice cut through the morning air like broken glass. "Where is that letter?" I saw the postman approaching. Eva climbed the marble steps slowly, each footfall echoing her resignation. Inside the opulent foyer, Constance Blackwood waited with her usual expression of barely concealed irritation. At 45, Constance was still a handsome woman, though the years of social climbing and ruthless ambition had carved hard lines around her mouth and eyes. She'd married Eva's father for his money and social position, tolerating his plain, awkward daughter from his first marriage as a necessary inconvenience. "Another letter for Serafina," Eva said quietly, extending the envelope. Constance snatched it with greedy fingers, her eyes lighting up as she examined the return address. "Colt Ashford," she breathed, as if the name were made of gold. "I've heard of him. Owns half of Colorado territory, they say. Cattle empire worth more than most Eastern fortunes." "Mama, what is it?" Serafina's melodious voice floated down the grand staircase as she descended like something from a fairy tale. At 22, Serafina Blackwood was everything Eva was not. Golden-haired, porcelain-skinned, with the kind of delicate beauty that made men forget their own names. She wore a morning dress of palest pink that complemented her complexion perfectly, every curl arranged with artful precision. "A marriage proposal, darling," Constance said, tearing open the envelope with trembling hands. "From a cattle baron in Colorado Territory." Eva watched from the corner as her stepmother read the letter aloud, her voice growing more excited with each word. Colt Ashford was looking for a wife, a woman of good breeding and moral character who could help him build a respectable household on the frontier. He'd heard of Serafina's beauty and accomplishments through mutual acquaintances and was prepared to offer marriage sight unseen, along with a substantial settlement and a life of comfort in his Colorado ranch. "Colorado?" Serafina wrinkled her perfect nose. "Mama, that's practically the wilderness. I can't possibly go to such a place. What about Boston? What about society?" "What about security?" Constance countered sharply. "Your father's debts are mounting, and your options here are dwindling. You've turned down 3 proposals this year alone." Eva knew her stepmother was right, though she'd never voiced such an opinion. The Blackwood fortune was largely an illusion maintained through careful social maneuvering and increasingly desperate borrowing. Serafina's beauty was their most valuable asset, but even beauty had an expiration date in Boston's cutthroat social scene. "I won't go," Serafina declared, with the imperious tone of someone who'd never been denied anything. "Find some other solution." That's when Constance's eyes fell on Eva, and a slow, cruel smile spread across her lips. Eva recognized that expression. It was the same look Constance got when she was planning one of her more vicious social maneuvers. "Actually," Constance said slowly, "I think I have an idea. A way to solve multiple problems at once." Eva's blood ran cold. Whatever her stepmother was planning, it wouldn't end well for her. "What do you mean?" Serafina asked, though she was already losing interest, examining her reflection in the hallway mirror. "Think about it, darling," Constance continued, her voice taking on that syrupy tone she used when she was being particularly manipulative. "This man is clearly desperate if he's willing to marry sight unseen. What kind of refined gentleman would choose to live in such primitive conditions? He's probably coarse, uneducated, possibly even dangerous. So?" Serafina shrugged, more concerned with adjusting her ringlets than following her mother's logic. "So we give him exactly what he deserves," Constance said, her smile growing wider. "We send him our other daughter." The words hit Eva like a physical blow. She'd been standing so quietly in the corner that she'd almost forgotten she was visible. But now both women turned to look at her with expressions that ranged from calculating to gleeful. "Mother, you can't be serious," Serafina gasped, though she was already starting to smile. "Send Eva?" "As me?" "Why not?" Constance's voice was warming to the theme now, the way it always did when she was enjoying someone else's discomfort. "He's expecting a mail-order bride, and that's exactly what he'll get. Just not the one he's bargaining for." "But the deception—" Eva found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What deception?" Constance snapped. "You're a Blackwood daughter, aren't you? Technically, we'll be fulfilling the contract exactly as written." "He's expecting Serafina specifically," Eva protested, though she knew it was useless. When Constance set her mind to something, particularly something cruel, there was no stopping her. "He's expecting Miss Blackwood," Constance corrected with vicious precision. "The letter doesn't specify which Miss Blackwood. And honestly, Eva, this might be your only chance at marriage. You should be grateful we're giving you this opportunity." Grateful. The word tasted like ashes in Eva's mouth. Grateful to be used as a weapon in her stepmother's petty revenge. Grateful to be sent across the country to disappoint a stranger. Grateful to be the punchline in a joke that would destroy any chance she might have had at happiness. "It's perfect." Serafina clapped her hands together like a child with a new toy. "Oh, Eva, you'll finally be useful for something. And just think of the look on that rancher's face when he sees what he's really getting instead of me." "Serafina," Constance warned, though she was still smiling, "we mustn't be too cruel. After all, we're doing Eva a favor. She'll have a husband, a home, and she'll be far enough away that her shortcomings won't reflect poorly on our family anymore." Eva stared at the two women who were supposed to love her, or at least care for her welfare, and felt something inside her chest crack open. She had always known she was unwanted, always understood that her presence was merely tolerated rather than celebrated. But this level of calculated cruelty was something new, even for them. "What if he sends me back?" she asked quietly. "Then you'll have had an adventure," Constance replied with a shrug. "More than you're likely to get sitting around here, taking up space and frightening away Serafina's suitors." The casual brutality of the comment made Eva flinch, but it also sparked something else. A tiny flame of anger that had been smoldering in her chest for years. Maybe this was her chance. Maybe being shipped off to Colorado territory like an unwanted package was exactly the escape she needed from this gilded prison, where she'd never be anything more than the disappointing daughter, the plain sister, the family embarrassment. "When would I leave?" she heard herself ask. Constance's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're agreeing to this?" Eva lifted her chin, feeling something like courage flowing through her veins for the first time in her life. "I'm agreeing to take control of my own destiny. If you want to send me to Colorado as part of your cruel little joke, then fine. But don't expect me to come crawling back when it doesn't go according to your plan." Something flickered in Constance's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first hint that this scheme might not unfold exactly as she'd envisioned. "The train leaves next Tuesday," she said slowly. "Mr. Ashford is expecting his bride by the end of the month." "Then I'd better start packing," Eva replied, and for the first time in years she smiled with genuine emotion. What none of them realized in that moment was that Eva Blackwood was about to become the best thing that ever happened to Colt Ashford, and that their cruel joke was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Colt Ashford stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch house, watching the sun paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson as another day died over Copper Ridge. At 35, he was a man who'd built an empire from nothing but determination and backbreaking work, transforming 15,000 acres of wild Colorado territory into one of the most successful cattle operations west of the Mississippi. But tonight, as he sipped his evening coffee and listened to the familiar sounds of his ranch settling into twilight, he wasn't thinking about cattle prices or water rights or any of the dozen concerns that usually occupied his mind. Tonight, he was thinking about her, Miss Serafina Blackwood, the Boston beauty who'd agreed to become his mail-order bride. The decision to seek a wife through correspondence hadn't been easy for a man of his pride and independence. Colt had spent the better part of 15 years proving he could survive and thrive without depending on anyone, building his fortune through sheer stubborn will and refusing to back down from any challenge the frontier threw at him. But success had its own kind of loneliness, and at 35 he was tired of eating supper alone and falling asleep to nothing but the sound of wind through the mountains. He pulled her letter from his vest pocket for the 12th time that week, though he knew every word by heart. The delicate handwriting, the careful phrases, the gentle refinement that spoke of good breeding and education. According to his contacts back east, Serafina Blackwood was everything a man could want in a wife. Beautiful, accomplished, from a respected family with old money and older bloodlines. Boss? The voice belonged to Miguel Santos, his foreman and closest friend for the past 8 years. "You gonna stand there mooning over that letter all night? Or you gonna help me figure out what we're doing with that north pasture?" Colt folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. "What's to figure out? We moved the herd up there next week, just like we planned." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Miguel stepped up onto the porch, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from years of friendship. "I'm talking about all this." He gestured toward the house, which had been a flurry of activity for the past 2 weeks, as Colt prepared for his bride's arrival. The changes had been substantial. New furniture ordered from Denver, curtains hung in windows that had stood bare for years, flowers planted in beds that had previously held nothing but practical vegetables. Inside, the spare bedroom had been transformed into something fit for a lady, complete with a vanity table, full-length mirror, and wardrobe large enough to hold the dozen trunks of clothing he imagined she'd bring from Boston. "A man's got a right to make his home comfortable for his wife," Colt said evenly. "Sure he does," Miguel agreed. "But this ain't just comfortable, hermano. This is, he searched for the right word. This is like you're expecting some kind of fairy tale princess to step off that train. Colt's jaw tightened. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've seen the way you look when you talk about this woman, Miguel replied bluntly. Like she's gonna solve all your problems, fill all the empty spaces, turn this place into something it ain't never been. And what's wrong with wanting something better? Nothing, as long as you remember she's a real person, not some perfect dream you've built up in your head. Miguel leaned against the porch railing, his expression serious. What happens if she don't live up to all these expectations you piled on her? What if she's just a regular woman with regular problems and regular flaws? Colt was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle high above the valley. The truth was, he had built up elaborate fantasies about what life would be like once Serafina arrived. He imagined her bringing grace and culture to his rough-hewn world, transforming his bachelor's quarters into a real home. He pictured her presiding over dinner parties for neighboring ranchers, her beauty and sophistication elevating his social standing in the territory. Most of all, he imagined coming home each evening to find her waiting for him, a civilized refuge from the harsh realities of frontier life. She's from good family, he said finally, educated, refined. The kind of woman who can help a man build something lasting. Or the kind who'll take one look at all this, Miguel gestured toward the vast expanse of prairie and mountains, and catch the next train back to Boston. The thought had occurred to Colt more than once during the sleepless nights of the past month. What if she hated the isolation? What if the rough reality of ranch life was too much for someone accustomed to Boston's civilized comforts? What if she took one look at him, a man whose hands bore the permanent stains of honest work, whose face was weathered by sun and wind, whose conversation ran more toward cattle and weather than literature and opera, and decided she'd made a terrible mistake? She agreed to come, he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. She agreed to marry a stranger and move to the middle of nowhere. Miguel corrected. That don't mean she's going to be happy about it once she gets here. Before Colt could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A rider emerged from the gathering dusk. Tommy McKenna, the youngest hand on the ranch, spurring his horse toward the house with obvious urgency. "Boss!" Tommy called out before he'd even dismounted. "Got news from town. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house sent me to fetch you." Colt straightened, his pulse quickening. Mrs. Henderson ran the only respectable lodging in Copper Ridge, and she'd agreed to house his bride temporarily until the wedding could be arranged. "What kind of news?" "Train came in this afternoon," Tommy panted, still catching his breath from his hard ride. "And there was a lady on it. A lady asking about you specifically." Colt's heart stopped. "She's here, but she wasn't due until next week." "Don't know about that, boss, but Mrs. Henderson says there's definitely a lady at her place claiming to be your mail-order bride. Says she's got papers and everything." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Serafina was here, a week early, waiting in town while he stood on his porch, completely unprepared. Colt ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The house wasn't quite ready. He'd planned to spend the weekend putting finishing touches on the bedroom, arranging the parlor furniture just so. He'd intended to meet her at the train station dressed in his best suit, flowers in hand, ready to make the kind of first impression that would set the tone for their entire marriage. "What did she look like?" he asked suddenly. Tommy blinked in surprise. "Sir?" "The lady. Did Mrs. Henderson say what she looked like?" "Oh," Tommy scratched his head thoughtfully. "Well, she said she seemed nice, quiet-like, real polite and well-mannered. It wasn't exactly the detailed description Colt had been hoping for, but it would have to do. "Get my horse saddled," he ordered. "I'm riding into town." "Boss?" Miguel's voice carried a note of warning. "Maybe you should wait until morning. Give yourself time to think, to prepare properly." "Prepare for what?" Colt was already moving toward the house, his mind shifting into the same focused determination that had built his empire. "She's my bride, she's here, and she's waiting for me." What's to prepare? But even as he said the words, anxiety gnawed at his stomach. What if she was disappointed by what she found in Colorado? What if the reality of ranch life was too harsh for someone accustomed to Boston's refinements? What if the chemistry they'd built through letters didn't translate to real life? Inside the house, he changed into his best clothes. A black suit he'd ordered from Denver, a white shirt with a proper collar, boots polished to a mirror shine. He stood before the mirror in his bedroom, trying to see himself through her eyes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and blue eyes that women had called handsome. But he bore the marks of his profession: calloused hands, a scar along his jawline from a run-in with an angry bull, the permanent squint lines that came from years of scanning distant horizons under the harsh mountain sun. Would she find him acceptable? Would she see past the rough exterior to the man who'd spent weeks planning every detail of her comfort? As he rode toward town through the gathering darkness, Colt found himself rehearsing what he'd say when he first saw her. Should he be formal and proper, the way Boston society probably demanded? Or should he be himself? Direct, honest, maybe a little awkward, but undeniably sincere. The lights of Copper Ridge appeared ahead, scattered yellow dots in the darkness like earthbound stars. Somewhere in that small collection of buildings, in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, the woman who would become his wife was waiting. The woman who would transform his bachelor existence into something richer, warmer, more complete. Colt urged his horse faster, his heart pounding with anticipation and terror in equal measure. In just a few minutes, he'd meet the woman he'd fallen half in love with through letters, the refined Eastern beauty who'd agreed to share his life and help him build something lasting in the Colorado wilderness. He had no idea that the woman waiting for him bore no resemblance to his carefully constructed fantasies. He couldn't have imagined that instead of the porcelain-perfect Serafina he'd been expecting, he was about to meet Eva Blackwood, tired, travel-stained, and convinced that her reception would be anything but welcoming. But sometimes the best surprises are the ones we never see coming, and sometimes what we think we want pales in comparison to what we actually need. Tonight, Colt Ashford was about to discover the difference. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house sat at the end of Copper Ridge's main street, like a beacon of respectability in a town that had grown up around mining claims and cattle drives. The two-story building was painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, its wraparound porch decorated with hanging baskets of wildflowers that Martha Henderson tended with the same fierce devotion she applied to protecting the virtue of her female guests. Colt tied his horse to the hitching post with hands that weren't quite steady, his heart hammering against his ribs as he climbed the front steps. Through the lace curtains of the parlor window, he could see the warm glow of oil lamps and the silhouettes of people moving about inside. One of those silhouettes was Serafina Blackwood, the woman who'd agreed to become his wife based on nothing more than letters and hope. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing Martha Henderson herself, a plump, motherly woman in her 60s who'd been the unofficial guardian of Copper Ridge's moral standards for as long as anyone could remember. Her expression was kind but concerned, the look she got when she was trying to figure out how to deliver unwelcome news diplomatically. "Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind her. "I'm glad you came so quickly." "Is she—" Colt cleared his throat, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Is Miss Blackwood comfortable? Does she need anything?" Martha's hands twisted in her apron, and Colt's stomach dropped. That was never a good sign with Martha Henderson. When the most unflappable woman in 3 counties started wringing her hands, it usually meant trouble. "She's a lovely young woman," Martha said carefully. "Very polite, very well-mannered. It's just—" She paused, clearly struggling with how to continue. "Just what?" "Well, I think there might be some confusion about expectations," Martha said delicately. "Perhaps you should speak with her yourself." "She's in the front parlor, waiting." Before Colt could ask what she meant by confusion about expectations, Martha was ushering him inside. The boarding house smelled of beeswax polish and the lavender sachets Martha tucked into every drawer and closet. It was warm, comfortable, and utterly civilized. Exactly the kind of environment where a refined Eastern lady would feel at home. "Miss Blackwood," Martha called out as they approached the parlor. "Mr. Ashford is here to see you." Colt straightened his shoulders and stepped through the doorway, his practiced greeting already forming on his lips. But the words died in his throat as he saw the woman rising from the wingback chair beside the fireplace. This was not Serafina Blackwood, at least not the Serafina Blackwood he'd been expecting. The woman before him was tall, taller than he'd imagined, with a sturdy, practical build that spoke of physical capability rather than delicate fragility. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun that had come slightly loose during her travels, with wisps framing a face that was not beautiful, not in the classical sense he'd been anticipating. Her features were strong rather than delicate, her skin slightly sun-touched rather than porcelain pale, her hands work-roughened rather than soft and white. But her eyes, dear God, her eyes were extraordinary. Dark brown flecked with gold, intelligent and direct. They met his gaze without flinching or looking away. There was strength in those eyes and honesty in something that might have been challenge. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Colt was dimly aware that his mouth was hanging open, that he was gaping like a fish pulled from water, but he couldn't seem to make his brain work properly. This was his mail-order bride. This was the delicate Boston flower he'd spent weeks preparing for. "Mr. Ashford," she said finally, her voice carrying a slight tremor despite her steady gaze. "I'm Eva Blackwood. I believe you were expecting me. Eva, not Serafina, Eva Blackwood." And suddenly, several pieces of a very unpleasant puzzle began falling into place in Colt's mind. "You're—" He cleared his throat, trying to gather his scattered thoughts. "You're not what I was expecting." Something flickered in those remarkable eyes. Hurt, maybe, or resignation. "No," she said quietly. "I imagine I'm not." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and dawning realizations. Behind him, Colt could hear Martha Henderson shifting uncomfortably, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. "Perhaps," Eva said with careful dignity, "you'd like to sit down. I think we need to discuss the situation." Colt nodded mutely and took the chair across from hers, his mind still reeling. The situation. That was one way to put it. Another way would be to call it a complete disaster. A bait and switch that would be funny if it weren't happening to him. "I assume," Eva continued, folding her hands in her lap with the composure of someone who'd had plenty of practice dealing with disappointment, "that you were expecting my sister, Serafina." "Sister?" The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "Half-sister, technically." Eva's smile was bitter around the edges. "Serafina is, well, she's everything I'm not. Beautiful, delicate, accomplished in all the ways that matter to society. She's also completely unwilling to leave Boston for what she considers the uncivilized wilderness." "So they sent you instead?" It wasn't a question. The pieces were falling together with horrible clarity. "They sent me instead," Eva confirmed. "As something of a joke, I'm afraid. My stepmother thought it would be amusing to give you exactly what you deserve for being the kind of man who'd seek a wife through correspondence." The casual cruelty of it hit Colt like a physical blow. They'd used this woman, their own family member, as a weapon in some petty act of revenge against a stranger they'd never met. They'd shipped her halfway across the country to be the punchline in a joke that would humiliate them both. "Jesus," he breathed. "I understand this is not what you bargained for," Eva said, her voice steady despite the fact that her knuckles had gone white where her hands were clasped. "I have enough money for return passage to Boston. If you'll allow me to stay the night, I can be on tomorrow's eastbound train." "You want to go back?" The question surprised him with its intensity. Something shifted in Eva's expression. "Want is a complicated word, Mr. Ashford. Do I want to return to a family that used me as the instrument of a cruel joke? Do I want to spend the rest of my life being reminded that I'm the disappointing daughter, the plain sister, the unmarriageable burden?" She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "No, but I also don't want to force my presence on a man who clearly finds me as much of a disappointment as my family does." The pain in her voice was unmistakable now, carefully controlled, but absolutely real. This woman had been hurt, systematically, repeatedly, by the very people who should have protected and cherished her. She'd been sent here expecting rejection, braced for humiliation, resigned to being unwanted once again. And Colt realized with startling clarity that he was furious. Not at her, never at her, but at the people who'd done this to her, at a family so casual in their cruelty that they'd sacrifice one of their own for a moment's entertainment. At a society that could look at this woman, this intelligent, dignified, obviously courageous woman, and see only disappointment because she didn't fit their narrow definition of feminine perfection? Miss Blackwood, he said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. I want to make something very clear. You are not a disappointment. You are not unwanted. And you are sure as hell not a joke. Her eyes widened as if she'd been expecting anything but those words. What you are, Colt continued, rising from his chair to pace toward the window, is the victim of some very small, very cruel people who don't deserve to shine your boots, let alone call themselves your family. Mr. Ashford, now I'll admit, he said, turning back to face her, you're not what I was expecting. I had some pretty specific ideas about what my wife would be like, and most of them were based on assumptions that are probably worth about as much as last week's newspaper. Eva's expression was unreadable, but she was listening intently. The question is, Colt said, meeting her gaze directly, what do you want? Not what your family wants, not what you think I want, but what you want. For yourself, for your life. For a long moment, Eva was silent. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I want to matter to someone, she said. I want to be valued for who I am, not dismissed for who I'm not. I want to build something real with someone who sees me as a partner, not a burden or a trophy or a punchline. She looked up at him with those extraordinary eyes. I want a chance to prove that there's more to me than my family ever bothered to see. Something tight and anxious in Colt's chest began to loosen. And if I were to offer you that chance, then I'd ask what you really want in a wife, Eva replied. Because if you're looking for a delicate ornament to grace your parlor, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm practical, I'm opinionated, and I have absolutely no intention of pretending to be something I'm not just to make other people comfortable. Despite everything, the shock, the confusion, the complete upending of his expectations, Colt found himself smiling. You know what, Miss Blackwood? I think I've had enough of pretending for one lifetime. Does that mean... It means, Colt said, extending his hand toward her, that maybe we should start over. I'm Colt Ashford, and I'm very pleased to meet the real Eva Blackwood. She looked at his outstretched hand for a moment before reaching out to take it. Her grip was firm, warm, and completely honest. Pleased to meet you too, Mr. Ashford, she said, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, she smiled. It transformed her entire face, revealing a warmth and humor that no amount of classical beauty could match. And Colt Ashford realized that his family's cruel joke might just turn out to be the best thing that had ever happened to him. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of rose and gold when Colt helped Eva into his wagon for the ride out to the ranch. She'd spent the night at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, and he'd lain awake in his own bed for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the woman he'd met with everything he'd thought he wanted in a wife. Eva Blackwood was nothing like the delicate, ornamental creature he'd been expecting. She was taller than most men, with strong hands and direct eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with keen intelligence. When she climbed into the wagon that morning, she'd done it without waiting for assistance, gathering her simple brown traveling dress with efficient movements that spoke of someone accustomed to taking care of herself. It's beautiful, she said quietly as they drove through the valley that led to his ranch, her gaze taking in the vast expanse of prairie grass dotted with grazing cattle. I'd heard the Western Territories were harsh, but this, she gestured toward the mountains rising like cathedral spires against the morning sky. This is magnificent. Colt found himself studying her profile as she spoke, noting the way the early light caught the gold flecks in her brown hair, the slight upturn of her nose that kept her strong features from being too severe. She wasn't conventionally pretty, but there was something compelling about her face, an openness, an intelligence that drew the eye and held it. It can be harsh, he said finally. Winters are brutal, summers are hot enough to kill a man if he's not careful, and we're 40 miles from the nearest real town. But it's not the kind of life most Eastern ladies would find comfortable. Eva turned to look at him then, one eyebrow raised in what might have been amusement. Mr. Ashford, I've spent 28 years being told I'm not like most ladies in any respect. I think I can handle a little discomfort. There was steel in her voice, quiet but unmistakable. This woman had been underestimated her entire life, and she was done apologizing for who she was. As they crested the rise that revealed his ranch house spread out below them, Colt found himself holding his breath. He'd been proud of what he'd built here, the sprawling log and stone house with its wide porches and dormered windows, the neat outbuildings and well-maintained corrals, the thousands of acres of prime grazing land that stretched as far as the eye could see. But suddenly he was seeing it through her eyes, wondering if a woman raised in Boston's refined society would find it crude and primitive. Eva was silent for a long moment, taking in the scope of his operation. Ranch hands were already at work in the distance, moving cattle and mending fences, their distant calls carried on the morning air. Horses grazed in the near pastures, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. "How many men do you employ?" she asked finally. 15 full-time hands, more during roundup season, Colt replied. "We run about 3,000 head of cattle on the home range, with grazing rights on another 10,000 acres of government land." "And you built all this yourself?" There was something in her tone he couldn't quite identify. Not awe exactly, but respect, interest. "Started with nothing but $100 and more stubborn than sense," he said. "That was 12 years ago. The first winter nearly killed me. Lived in a one-room shack and ate beans and hardtack for 3 months straight." "What made you stay?" It was a good question, one he'd asked himself plenty of times during those early years when everything seemed to go wrong at once. Cattle dying, water rights disputed, winters that seemed to last forever. "Freedom, I guess," he said finally. "Back east, a man's born into his place and stays there. Out here, you can be whoever you're strong enough to become." Eva nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant. "Yes," she said quietly, "I can see the appeal in that." The wagon rolled into the yard, and almost immediately they were surrounded by ranch hands who'd come to see the boss's new bride. Colt helped Eva down, acutely aware of the way the men were looking at her. Not with the leering appreciation he'd expected, but with puzzled concern. This was clearly not what any of them had been expecting either. "Boys," Colt said, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of leadership, "I'd like you to meet my wife-to-be, Miss Eva Blackwood." "Miss Blackwood, this is my crew." The men touched their hats respectfully, murmuring greetings, but Colt could see the questions in their eyes. Miguel stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Ma'am," he said with a slight nod, "welcome to the Ashford Ranch." "Thank you," Eva replied, and Colt was struck by how naturally she seemed to accept the introductions. No shrinking back, no obvious discomfort at being surrounded by rough-weathered men who probably hadn't seen soap and water in a week. "It's a beautiful operation you have here." "We like to think so," Miguel said, though his eyes flicked to Colt with obvious concern. "Miss Blackwood had a long journey," Colt said. "I thought I'd show her the house. Let her get settled." The men dispersed back to their work, but Colt could feel their curious gazes following as he escorted Eva up the front steps. The house he'd been so proud of suddenly seemed too big, too masculine, too much like the bachelor quarters it had always been. Inside, Eva moved through the rooms with the same measured attention she'd given the landscape, taking in the heavy furniture, the stone fireplace that dominated the main room, the wide windows that looked out over the valley. He tried to soften the space for her expected arrival. Fresh flowers on the mantel, new curtains in the parlor, a delicate tea service displayed prominently on the sideboard. But now those touches seemed forced, artificial attempts to impose Eastern refinement on a fundamentally Western space. "This is lovely," Eva said, though he wasn't sure she meant it. She paused before the large window that looked out over the corrals, watching as his men worked with a group of half-wild Mustangs. "Do you break all your own horses?" "Most of them. Some we buy already trained, but the Mustangs—" He joined her at the window. "They're cheaper to catch wild, and they're tougher once they're broken. Better suited to ranch work. It looks dangerous. It can be. Takes skill and patience more than anything else." Eva was quiet for a moment, watching as one of his younger hands was thrown by a particularly spirited bay mare. The young man got up, dusted himself off, and climbed back into the saddle without hesitation. "He's not hurt?" she asked. "Jake?" "Nah, he's tougher than old leather. Been thrown by that mare 3 times this week, but he'll have her gentled by Sunday." "Gentled?" Eva repeated thoughtfully. Not broken. There's a difference, Colt agreed. Break a horse's spirit, and you've got an animal that'll do what you tell it out of fear. Gentle it, and you've got a partner who'll work with you because it chooses to. Something in Eva's expression shifted, and when she looked at him, there was a new kind of awareness in her eyes. I imagine that philosophy applies to more than just horses. The observation was so acute, so perfectly on target, that Colt felt a little jolt of surprise. This woman saw things, understood connections that others might miss entirely. I've found it works pretty well with most living creatures, he said carefully. They were interrupted by the sound of boots on the front porch, followed by Miguel's distinctive knock. Colt opened the door to find his foreman holding a telegram, his expression troubled. Sorry to interrupt, boss, but this just came in from town. Thought you'd want to see it right away. Colt took the yellow paper, his heart sinking as he read the brief message. Eva stepped closer, concern evident in her face. Bad news? She asked. Telegram from your family, Colt said quietly, handing her the paper. They're asking if you arrived safely. Eva read the message, and Colt watched her face change. What had started as simple curiosity transformed into something harder, more bitter. How thoughtful of them, she said, her voice carefully controlled. I'm sure they're very concerned about my welfare. But Colt could read between the lines as clearly as she could. This wasn't concern. This was Constance Blackwood checking to see if her cruel joke had worked, if Eva's arrival had caused the humiliation and rejection she'd intended. You don't have to answer it, he said. Oh, but I do. Eva folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her pocket. In fact, I think I'll compose a very detailed response about how well I've been received, how comfortable I am, and how much I'm looking forward to. My new life as Mrs. Colt Ashford. There was steel in her voice again, but this time it was tempered with something that might have been satisfaction. Eva Blackwood was done being the victim of her family's cruelty. She was ready to fight back. Mrs. Colt Ashford, Colt repeated slowly, you're really planning to go through with this? The wedding, I mean? Eva turned to face him fully, her brown eyes steady and determined. Mr. Ashford, I came here expecting to be rejected, humiliated, and sent home in shame. Instead, I found a man who treats me with respect, a home that feels more welcoming than any place I've ever lived, and the possibility of a life where I can be valued for who I am, rather than dismissed for who I'm not. She paused, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. If you're willing to take a chance on the ugly daughter your letter was never meant for, then yes, I'd be honored to become Mrs. Colt Ashford. And looking into those remarkable eyes, seeing the strength and honesty and quiet courage that radiated from every line of her body, Colt realized that his family's cruel joke had given him exactly what he'd never known he needed. Not the ornamental beauty he'd thought he wanted, but a real partner who could match his strength with her own. 3 weeks into her stay at the Ashford Ranch, Eva Blackwood had settled into a routine that would have horrified her Boston stepmother and scandalized every proper lady in Beacon Hill society. She rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spent her mornings learning the practical skills of frontier life, and devoted her afternoons to whatever tasks needed doing around the ranch. Whether that meant mending clothes, tending the vegetable garden, or helping with the endless bookkeeping that kept a cattle operation running smoothly. And she'd never been happier in her life. This morning, she stood at the kitchen window watching Colt work with a particularly stubborn Mustang in the main corral, her hands busy kneading dough for the evening's bread. The horse, a beautiful paint mare with fire in her eyes and rebellion in every line of her body, had been refusing to accept either saddle or rider for the better part of a week. Most of the hands had given up on her, declaring her too wild to be worth the effort. But Colt was patient, moving slowly and deliberately, never forcing the issue, always giving the mare a choice. It was the same approach he'd taken with Eva herself, gentle but persistent, offering respect and partnership rather than demanding submission. Miss Eva? The voice belonged to Rosa Martinez, Miguel's wife, who'd become Eva's closest friend and unofficial guide to ranch life. You're burning holes in that man with your staring. Eva felt her cheeks warm. I was watching him work with the horse. Mm-hmm. Rosa's tone was rich with amusement. That's what I was watching too. The horse. Before Eva could protest, the kitchen door burst open and Tommy McKenna stumbled inside, his face pale and his left arm hanging at an awkward angle. Rosa! Miss Ava! He gasped. There's been an accident down at the south pasture. Miguel sent me back for help. Eva was moving before she'd fully processed his words, her hands already reaching for the medical supplies she'd insisted Colt keep in the kitchen. During her years in Boston, she'd volunteered at the charity hospital, learning basic nursing skills that her family had considered an unseemly interest, but which had proven invaluable on the ranch. What happened? She asked, wrapping Tommy's arm in a makeshift sling. New hand got kicked by one of the steers, Tommy replied through gritted teeth. Broke his leg real bad. Maybe some ribs, too. Miguel's got him stabilized, but he needs proper doctoring. The nearest doctor is in town, Rosa said worriedly. That's a 4-hour ride each way, and with his injuries. Then we'll have to handle it ourselves, Eva said matter-of-factly, filling her medical bag with supplies. Rosa, can you send someone to fetch Colt? And I'll need clean sheets, hot water, and that bottle of whiskey Miguel keeps hidden behind the flour sacks. Rosa stared at her. Miss Eva, you can't possibly... I've set bones before, Eva replied calmly. Admittedly, they belong to horses rather than men, but the principles are the same. And right now, I'm the closest thing to a doctor this man is going to get. 20 minutes later, Eva found herself kneeling in the dirt beside a young cowhand named Billy Morrison, whose pale, pain-twisted face told her everything she needed to know about the severity of his injuries. Miguel crouched beside her, his usual composure shaken by the sight of his injured man. How bad? Colt asked tersely as he joined them, having ridden hard from the main corral. Broken leg, definitely, Eva replied, her hands moving gently over Billy's injuries with practiced efficiency. Probably a couple of cracked ribs. He's lost some blood, but not dangerously so. She looked up at Colt. We need to get him back to the house where I can work properly. Eva, Colt said quietly, maybe we should wait for the doctor. He could bleed internally waiting for the doctor, Eva replied firmly. His leg needs to be set now, before the swelling gets worse and the bone starts healing crooked. She saw the uncertainty in Colt's eyes, the natural reluctance to trust such serious medical work to someone without formal training. But Billy groaned, trying to shift his position, and the sound decided her. Miguel, I need 4 men and a board to carry him on, she ordered with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. And someone needs to ride ahead and have Rosa prepare the dining room table. For a moment, nobody moved. These were men accustomed to taking orders from Colt, not from the Eastern woman who'd arrived 3 weeks ago as a mail-order bride. Eva could see the doubt in their faces, the uncertainty about whether to trust her with Billy's life. Then Colt stepped forward. You heard her, he said quietly. Move. The next 2 hours tested every skill Eva had learned during her hospital volunteer work, and several she had to improvise on the spot. With Billy unconscious from the whiskey they'd used to dull his pain, she set his broken leg with steady hands, her movements confident despite the circle of worried men watching her every move. Hold him still, she murmured to Miguel as she manipulated the bone back into alignment. Billy's body convulsed despite his unconscious state, but Eva didn't falter. Almost got it. There. The bone clicked into place with an audible sound that made several of the watching men wince. Eva quickly splinted the leg with wooden slats and strips of torn sheeting, her movements economical and sure. Rosa, I need you to bind his ribs, she instructed. Not too tight. He needs to be able to breathe. And keep checking his pupils. If they become unequal or stop responding to light, call me immediately. Yes, Miss Eva, Rosa replied. And Eva noted that there was no question in her voice now, only trust and respect. By the time she'd finished treating Billy's injuries and settled him in the guest bedroom with strict instructions about his care, the sun was setting and Eva was exhausted. She found Colt waiting for her on the front porch, his expression unreadable in the gathering twilight. How is he? Colt asked as she sank into the chair beside him. He'll live, Eva replied simply. The leg will heal crooked if he doesn't follow orders about staying off it, and he'll probably have some interesting scars, but he'll live. Colt was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile in the lamplight. Where did you learn to do that? Boston General Hospital, Eva said. I volunteered there for 3 years. My stepmother thought it was an unseemly interest for a lady, but my father believed in the value of practical skills. Her mouth curved in a bitter smile. Ironic that Constance's disapproval led to something so useful. The men are impressed, Colt said finally. Miguel told me he's never seen anyone work so calmly under pressure. Says you've got steady hands and a cool head. High praise from Miguel. The highest. Colt leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving over the darkening landscape. You know, when I wrote that letter to your family, I had a very specific idea of what I wanted in a wife. Someone refined, decorative, who could bring a touch of Eastern civilization to this rough place. Ava's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. And now? Now I realize I was an idiot. Colt turned to look at her directly. A decorative wife would have fainted at the sight of blood. A refined lady would have insisted on waiting for the proper doctor while Billy suffered. But you, he shook his head, you saw what needed doing, and you did it without hesitation, without worrying about whether it was ladylike or appropriate. It's who I am, Eva said quietly. I've never been good at being ornamental. Thank God for that, Colt replied with feeling. Eva, what you did today, saving Billy's life, earning the respect of men who've worked this ranch for years, that's worth more than all the refinement and delicate beauty in the world. Something warm and bright bloomed in Eva's chest. For the first time in her life, someone was praising her for being exactly who she was, rather than criticizing her for who she wasn't. The wedding, she said suddenly. Are we still? More than ever, Colt replied without hesitation. If you're willing to have me. Eva looked out over the ranch that was becoming home, at the mountains that stood like sentinels against the star-filled sky, and thought about the life she could build here. A life where her practical skills would be valued, where her strength would be an asset rather than an embarrassment, where she could be a true partner to a man who saw her worth. I'm willing, she said simply. That night, as she prepared for bed in the room that would soon be theirs to share, Eva caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was sunburned and work-roughened, with calloused hands and hair that had given up any pretense of fashionable styling. She looked nothing like the refined Boston lady she'd been raised to become. She looked like exactly who she was meant to be, and for the first time in her 28 years, that was enough. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning, just 2 days before Eva and Colt's wedding. She was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on the cake that would serve as their wedding dessert, when Miguel brought in the mail with an expression she'd learned to recognize as trouble brewing. This one's from Boston, he said quietly, handing her an envelope addressed in her stepmother's unmistakable handwriting. Constance Blackwood. Eva wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and took the letter, her heart already steeling itself for whatever fresh cruelty Constance had decided to inflict. It had been 6 weeks since she'd sent her own carefully worded response to their telegram, informing them that she was not only staying in Colorado, but preparing to marry Colt Ashford. She'd expected retaliation, but the silence had stretched so long, she'd begun to hope they'd simply written her off entirely. She should have known better. Bad news? Rosa asked, looking up from where she was arranging wildflowers for the wedding decorations. Let's find out, Eva murmured, breaking the wax seal with hands that were steadier than she felt. The letter was 3 pages of Constance's most poisonous prose, written in the same elegant script she used for social correspondence, but filled with venom that made Eva's stomach clench. My dear Evangeline, your father and I have been quite concerned since receiving your last communication. We cannot help but feel that you have been taken advantage of by this man Ashford, who has clearly convinced you to participate in what can only be described as an elaborate deception. I write now to inform you that we have been in correspondence with several prominent citizens of Colorado Territory, including the territorial governor himself, regarding the fraudulent circumstances of your so-called engagement. It seems that Mr. Ashford has been presenting you throughout Copper Ridge as his intended bride, Miss Seraphina Blackwood, when any person of sense can see that you are most certainly not the woman he contracted to marry. This deception cannot be allowed to continue. Your father has therefore engaged the services of Pinkerton detectives to investigate Mr. Ashford's character and motives. We have every reason to believe that he is either a fortune hunter who intends to hold you against your will until he can extract money from our family, or worse, a man of such poor moral character that he would knowingly participate in fraud for his own amusement. Serafina wishes me to tell you that she bears you no ill will for this unfortunate situation, though she is naturally mortified that her name has been associated with such a sordid affair. She has recently become engaged to Mr. Theodore Worthington III, a gentleman of impeccable breeding and considerable fortune who would never dream of involving himself in such unseemly schemes. We have arranged for travel funds to be sent to the First Bank of Denver, sufficient for your immediate return to Boston. You will present yourself at the bank with this letter and proper identification, whereupon the funds will be released to you. We expect your return within the month, at which time we will discuss the best methods for repairing the damage this adventure has done to our family's reputation. Do not mistake our intervention for concern about your welfare. Your father is thinking only of the family name and the necessity of extricating ourselves from this embarrassment before it becomes public knowledge. Serafina's engagement to Mr. Worthington represents an opportunity to elevate our social position considerably, and we cannot allow your misguided actions to interfere with her prospects. I trust you will see the wisdom of ending this charade immediately and returning to Boston, where you belong. Your affectionate stepmother, Mrs. Constance Blackwood. Eva read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly by the time she finished. The casual cruelty was breathtaking even by Constance's standards, threatening to destroy Colt's reputation, questioning his character to territorial authorities, and making it clear that Eva's welfare mattered less than protecting Serafina's social advancement. "Eva?" Rosa's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "What is it?" Instead of answering, Eva handed Rosa the letter and walked outside, needing air and space to think. She found herself in the corral where Colt was working with the paint mare that had finally accepted both saddle and rider. The horse moved with fluid grace now, responding to Colt's gentle commands with the trust that came from being gentled rather than broken. "Eva!" Colt had seen her expression and was already dismounting, his face creased with concern. "What's wrong?" "My family," she said simply, then found she couldn't continue. The magnitude of their vindictiveness was overwhelming. Not content with using her as the instrument of a cruel joke, they now intended to destroy the happiness she'd found in Colorado. Colt took the letter from her unresisting fingers and read it quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. By the time he finished, his jaw was set in the hard lines she'd learned to recognize as barely contained fury. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "They're actually threatening to have me investigated for fraud." "They want to destroy you," Eva said quietly, "because you didn't reject me the way they expected. Because their joke backfired and I found happiness instead of humiliation." "They can investigate all they want," Colt said grimly. "I've got nothing to hide." "But Eva," he looked at her with something like pain in his eyes. "This could get ugly. If they're talking to the territorial governor, if they're spreading lies about fraud and deception, it could affect the ranch, my business relationships, everything I've built here." Eva nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. He was offering her a way out, a chance to return to Boston before her presence destroyed everything he'd worked for. It was the noble thing to do, the self-sacrificing gesture of a man who cared more about her welfare than his own desires. And it was exactly the wrong thing to say to a woman who'd spent her entire life being told she wasn't worth fighting for. "Colt Ashford," she said, her voice carrying the same steel that had gotten her through 28 years of family cruelty. "Are you actually suggesting that I run back to Boston with my tail between my legs because my stepmother made some threats?" "I'm suggesting that you don't deserve to be caught in the middle of whatever ugly business this becomes," Colt replied. "You didn't ask for any of this." "No, I didn't ask for it," Eva agreed. "I didn't ask to be used as a weapon in my family's petty revenge. I didn't ask to be threatened and manipulated and treated like a disposable pawn in their social games. But I also didn't ask to find a man who sees my worth, a community that respects my contributions, and a life that feels like home for the first time in my existence." She stepped closer to him, her brown eyes blazing with determination. "They want a fight? Then they'll get one, but it won't be the fight they're expecting." "Eva, no." She held up a hand to silence his protests. "I'm done running, Colt. I'm done being ashamed of who I am, done apologizing for taking up space in the world, Done letting cruel people dictate the terms of my existence. She turned and walked back toward the house, her mind already working. By the time she reached the kitchen, she knew exactly what she was going to do. "Rosa," she said, settling herself at the kitchen table with paper and pen, "I'm going to need you to witness something." "Of course, Miss Eva. What are you writing?" "A letter," Eva replied, dipping her pen in ink with deliberate precision. "To the territorial governor, the Pinkerton detectives, and anyone else who might be interested in the truth about the Blackwood family's concern for their daughter." She began to write, her words flowing with the clarity that came from finally understanding her own worth. "To whom it may concern, I am Evangeline Blackwood of Boston, Massachusetts, and I write to address certain allegations that may have been brought to your attention regarding my engagement to Mr. Colt Ashford of Copper Ridge, Colorado Territory. I wish to make absolutely clear that there has been no fraud, deception, or coercion in my relationship with Mr. Ashford. I came to Colorado Territory of my own free will as a mail-order bride responding to his advertisement for a wife. While it is true that my family may have led Mr. Ashford to expect my half-sister, Serafina, I was explicitly sent in her place with the full knowledge and approval of my stepmother, Mrs. Constance Blackwood. The purpose of this substitution was not to honor the spirit of Mr. Ashford's request for a wife, but to humiliate both Mr. Ashford and myself as part of what my stepmother considered an amusing joke. They believed that sending the family's ugly daughter, instead of the beautiful Serafina, would result in my immediate rejection and Mr. Ashford's embarrassment. Instead, Mr. Ashford has treated me with respect, honor, and genuine affection. He has asked nothing of me but my own honest self, and has offered in return a partnership based on mutual regard and shared values. Our engagement is entirely voluntary, completely legal, and has brought me more happiness than I have ever known. Any investigation into Mr. Ashford's character will find him to be a man of impeccable reputation, successful business practices, and unquestionable integrity. He is respected throughout the territory as a fair employer, honest dealer, and valued member of the community. The same, I regret to say, cannot be said of my Boston family, whose treatment of me has been characterized by systematic cruelty, calculated humiliation, and a callous disregard for my welfare that culminated in their attempt to use me as an instrument of revenge against an innocent man. I am not being held against my will. I am not the victim of fraud or deception. I am simply a woman who has found love and respect in an unexpected place, and who refuses to allow the vindictive schemes of my family to destroy the happiness I have earned. I remain respectfully yours, Miss Evangeline Blackwood, soon to be Mrs. Colt Ashford." Eva signed the letter with a flourish and looked up to find both Rosa and Miguel watching her with expressions of awe and admiration. "Miss Eva," Rosa breathed, "that is the most magnificent thing I have ever heard." "It's not finished yet," Eva replied, reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. "Now I'm going to write to every newspaper between here and Boston, telling them exactly what kind of people the Blackwoods really are, and then I'm going to write to Constance herself." This final letter was shorter but infinitely more satisfying. "Dear Constance, thank you for your letter and your concern about my welfare. I am delighted to inform you that your cruel joke has resulted in consequences you never anticipated. Mr. Colt Ashford is indeed everything you assumed he was not: wealthy, respected, honorable, and possessed of enough intelligence to value substance over superficial beauty. He has asked me to marry him not despite who I am, but because of who I am. Our wedding will take place as scheduled, and I expect to spend the rest of my life as a cherished wife and valued partner. I have taken the liberty of sharing the true circumstances of my arrival in Colorado Territory with the territorial governor, several prominent newspapers, and anyone else who might be interested in your family's creative approach to social cruelty. I trust this will not interfere with Serafina's engagement to Mr. Worthington, though you may wish to warn him that marrying into the Blackwood family comes with certain reputational challenges. Please do not trouble yourself with further correspondence. I find the distance has given me remarkable clarity about the true nature of our relationship, and I have no desire to maintain connections with people who would use their own family members as instruments of petty revenge. I remain happily and permanently your former victim, Mrs. Evangeline Ashford. By the time you receive this, Eva sealed the letters with wax, her hands steady and her heart lighter than it had been in years. She was done being the victim of her family's cruelty, done apologizing for existing, done accepting less than she deserved. Send these today, she told Miguel, handing him the bundle of correspondence. And Miguel, make sure the one to the territorial governor gets delivered personally. Yes, ma'am, Miguel replied, and there was something like pride in his voice. Anything else? Eva looked out the window toward the mountains that had become home, toward the life she'd built with a man who saw her worth, toward the future that stretched ahead bright with possibility. Yes, she said with a smile that transformed her entire face. Make sure everyone in 3 counties knows there's going to be a wedding tomorrow, and they're all invited. I want the biggest, most joyful celebration this territory has ever seen. You want to show them what happiness looks like, Rosa said, understanding immediately. Exactly, Eva replied. I want to show them what happens when someone's cruel joke becomes someone else's greatest blessing. And as she returned to decorating her wedding cake, Eva Blackwood, soon to be Eva Ashford, knew that her family's attempt to destroy her had instead given her everything she'd never dared to dream of having. Sometimes the best revenge really was living well. 6 months later, Eva Ashford stood on the front porch of her home, watching the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and rose. A letter from Boston crumpled in her hand and a smile of pure satisfaction on her face. The letter had arrived the previous day, written in Constance's increasingly desperate handwriting, and its contents had provided Eva with more entertainment than any opera or society gathering ever had. The Blackwood family's reputation in Boston society had not survived Eva's counterattack. Her detailed letters to newspapers across the eastern seaboard had sparked a scandal that reverberated through every drawing room and social club from Beacon Hill to Philadelphia. The story of a family so cruel they'd use their own daughter as the punchline in a vicious joke had captured the public imagination in the worst possible way for the Blackwoods. Seraphina's engagement to Theodore Worthington III had been quietly but definitively ended when the Worthington family decided they could not risk association with such scandalous people. 3 other prominent Boston families had withdrawn their invitations to the Blackwoods' annual social events. Even their church had suggested they might be more comfortable worshiping elsewhere for a while, until the unfortunate publicity died down. But the most delicious irony of all was revealed in Constance's desperate letter. With their social standing destroyed and their financial situation increasingly precarious, the Blackwood family now found themselves in need of the very thing they tried to deny Eva, an advantageous marriage connection that could restore their fortunes and reputation. We have reconsidered our position regarding your marriage, Constance had written in words that must have burned her throat to pen. Perhaps we were too hasty in our initial concerns about Mr. Ashford's character. Your father and I would very much like to visit Colorado Territory and meet our new son-in-law properly. Eva had read that line aloud to Colt over breakfast, and they'd both laughed until tears ran down their faces. The idea that Constance and her father now wanted to claim connection to the very marriage they'd engineered as a cruel joke was the perfect capstone to their spectacular downfall. I think we'll tell them we're too busy with ranch business to receive visitors, Colt had said, his blue eyes dancing with mirth. Maybe next decade, when our schedules clear up. Now, as Eva watched her husband work with a new group of Mustangs in the morning corral, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The woman who'd stepped off the train in Copper Ridge 6 months ago, uncertain, wounded, expecting rejection, bore little resemblance to the confident rancher's wife she'd become. The community that had initially been puzzled by Colt's plain bride now regarded her with the kind of respect and affection that no amount of classical beauty could have earned. She was the woman who'd saved Billy Morrison's life with her steady hands and quick thinking, the wife who could birth a calf as skillfully as she could balance the ranch's books, the neighbor who'd organize relief efforts when the winter storms hit harder than expected, turning the ranch house into a temporary shelter for stranded families. She'd become exactly what she'd always had the potential to be, a woman whose worth was measured by her actions, her intelligence, her strength of character, and her capacity for love. All the things that mattered, and none of the superficial attributes that her Boston family had fixated on. Mrs. Ashford! The voice belonged to Jenny Patterson, the young daughter of a neighboring rancher, who came running up the path with the breathless excitement that only an 8-year-old could muster. "Mama says to tell you the baby's coming." She says, "Can you come now, please?" Eva was already moving, her medical bag always kept ready for such emergencies. In the 6 months since Billy's accident, she'd become the unofficial doctor for every ranch family within 50 miles, her reputation for skill and calm under pressure spreading throughout the territory. "Tell your mom I'll be right there," she called to Jenny, then turned toward the corral where Colt was working. "The Patterson baby's coming," she shouted. Colt waved his acknowledgement and began saddling a fresh horse for her. This too had become routine, Eva riding out at all hours to help with medical emergencies, births, accidents, and illnesses throughout their extended community. She was needed here in ways she'd never been needed in Boston, valued for abilities that her family had never even recognized she possessed. As she rode toward the Patterson Ranch, Eva thought about the life she might have lived if her family's joke had unfolded as planned. She might have returned to Boston in shame, confirmed in their opinion that she was worthless, unwanted, destined to live on the margins of other people's happiness. Instead, she'd found a partner who saw her strength as an asset rather than a flaw. She'd discovered work that fulfilled her in a community that valued her contributions. She'd learned that love wasn't about meeting someone else's expectations, but about finding someone who appreciated you exactly as you were. 8 hours later, as she placed a healthy baby boy in Susan Patterson's arms and watched the new mother's face transform with joy, Eva felt that familiar surge of satisfaction that came from using her skills to help others. This was what she'd been meant for, not sitting in Boston parlors, making polite conversation about nothing, but making a real difference in people's lives. The ride home took her past the small cemetery where the territorial community laid their loved ones to rest. Eva always slowed here, not from morbid fascination, but from gratitude. Among the weathered headstones was a small marker for the child she might have been. Eva Blackwood, the ugly daughter who'd never been good enough, who died the day she stepped off that train and chose to become someone new. Now she was Eva Ashford, beloved wife, skilled healer, valued community member, and woman who'd turned her family's cruelest joke into her greatest triumph. She was proof that sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up giving us exactly what we need to find our true destiny. Back at the ranch, she found Colt waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee and the kind of smile that made her heart skip a beat even after 6 months of marriage. "How are mother and baby?" he asked as she settled beside him. "Perfect," Eva replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Absolutely perfect." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had become home. In the distance, cattle lowed softly and horses moved like shadows in the gathering dusk. It was the sound of a life well lived, a love well found, and a future bright with promise. "Any regrets?" Colt asked quietly, the question he'd posed several times during their marriage. Eva smiled, thinking of Constance's desperate letter, of Serafina's ruined engagement, of a Boston family that had destroyed itself through its own cruelty. She thought of the life she'd built here, the love she'd found, the person she'd become. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret that it took me 28 years to discover that the greatest revenge against people who don't value you is to find people who do." What do you think of Eva's incredible transformation from unwanted daughter to beloved wife and community pillar? Have you ever felt overlooked or undervalued by people who should have seen your worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story of finding where you truly belong might inspire someone else who's still searching. If stories like Eva's speak to your heart, tales of underdogs who rise above cruelty to find their perfect match and true calling, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories and hit that notification bell. We're here to remind you that your worth isn't determined by other people's limitations, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most unlikely circumstances. Remember, the people who can't see your value don't deserve a place in your story. Keep writing new chapters until you find the ones who celebrate exactly who you are. Until our next frontier adventure, keep believing that every ending can become a new beginning, and that true love sees beauty where others see only flaws. Your perfect match might be waiting in the most unexpected place.